Very good morning to my dear children. Yesterday in our online class we did the fixed capital requirement of a business enterprise. So today in our online class we would be covering working capital requirement of a business enterprise. What is working capital? Working capital means capital which is invested in current assets of a firm. That means capital is invested in those assets which help a firm in day-to-day operations of an enterprise, and hence working capital is also called circulating or revolving capital. Working capital is called circulating capital because it is invested, recovered, reinvested, and these three processes are repeatedly done during the operating cycle of a business. Working capital is basically of two types: gross working capital GWC and net working capital. Gross working capital means the total amount of funds invested in current assets of the firm. That means working capital is equal to the book value of current assets, whereas net working capital is excess of current assets over current liabilities. Why do we require working capital? Working capital is helpful in meeting day-to-day expenses, paying salary and wages to workers and staff members, and lastly, to purchase of raw material, semi-finished product, materials, etc. Working capital is of two types: permanent working capital and temporary working capital. Permanent working capital refers to the capital which is required permanently to operate the minimum level of business activity. Permanent working capital is further divided into initial working capital and regular working capital. Initial working capital, as the name itself suggests, this type of capital is required initially or at the time of commencement of business, whereas regular working capital, as the name itself suggests, this type of working capital is required regularly, that is, it is required for continuous and regular business activities. Why does a company or a firm require initial working capital? A company requires initial working capital because initially business does not get credit from suppliers. That means all the expenses have to be incurred in cash, and this cash is provided by the owner. Whereas regular working capital is required to meet short-term obligations like building up of inventory, that is purchasing of inventory, so that there is no hindrance or obstacle in the production process. The second type of working capital is temporary working capital. Temporary working capital is basically to meet seasonal and special needs of business. Seasonal working capital means firm dealing in product of seasonal nature. For example, woolen industry require seasonal capital so that they can buy raw material during busy season and can pay extra to the labor. Whereas special working capital is basically to meet special or future contingencies, like to meet sudden growth in demand, or during depression, or during strike, lockout, or a natural calamity. Hence, temporary capital is an addition to permanent working capital, and therefore it is also called variable working capital because it keeps on fluctuating.